What if the deadliest ghost story on Earth isn't about spirits, but about a silent killer drifting for decades beneath the waves? Every single year, 640,000 metric tons of fishing gear are abandoned in our oceans. These nets, made of nearly indestructible nylon, never stop killing, ensnaring whales, turtles, and seals in a cycle of death. But a revolution is rising from the wreckage, turning these weapons of mass extinction into pristine nylon pellets that power the world's most coveted products. This is the invisible transformation happening inside the net recycler. Ghost nets. Millions of tons of abandoned fishing gear, silently killing marine life 24/7. The problem is catastrophic. But here's the twist. These nets are the same nylon as your jacket. A quiet revolution is turning ocean killers into pristine plastic pellets. And the process? It's more insane than you'd ever believe. Every year, an estimated 640,000 metric tons of fishing gear are abandoned, lost, or deliberately dumped into the ocean. That's more than 50,000 double-decker buses year after year. And here is the terrifying part. This isn't passive litter. It's a weapon engineered to capture and kill. Once it escapes human control, it never stops. It becomes a ghost. Take a single gill net that spent just 6 months lost in Puget Sound. When divers recovered it, they found 450 salmon, 1,300 sharks, 1,800 seabirds, and nearly 17,000 crabs, all dead, all from one net. Now multiply that by the millions of ghost nets haunting every ocean on Earth. These nets are built to endure. They're made of nylon 6 and nylon 6/6 fibers, so tough they resist salt, sun, and decades of pounding waves. They never truly biodegrade. They just keep drifting, ensnaring everything in their path, then slowly fragmenting into microplastics that work their way up the food chain. That resilience, however, holds a secret. Nylon is one of the most recyclable plastics on the planet. The same material that makes a killer net is chemically identical to the nylon in your jacket, your toothbrush, your phone case. A handful of visionaries saw this hidden value. Nicole Baker, a former fishery observer, founded Net Your Problem in the Aleutian Islands. She began convincing Alaska's fishing fleets that their retired gear wasn't garbage, it was an asset. Down south, the company Bureo partnered with coastal villages in Chile to create a supply chain for end-of-life nets. Their goal: collect the nets before they ever reach the sea, then feed them into an industrial process that would turn this toxic plague into pristine recycled nylon pellets. But getting a weather-beaten, salt-encrusted tangle of net from a remote dock to a recycling plant is a logistical nightmare. And even once it arrives, the transformation is nothing short of violent. To make something pure enough for a brand new jacket, the nets must first face a shredder that eats through steel cables, a furnace that melts at over 250 degrees Celsius, and a filtration system that will reject any hint of contamination. One wrong move, and the entire batch is ruined. But if it works, you've just turned a marine serial killer into a raw material worth more than virgin plastic. That's the promise. The reality, though, is far more messy, and that's where our story truly begins, inside the throat of the beast. At the heart of the net recycler is a machine no worker wants to get close to, the industrial shredder. Picture a giant steel mouth filled with rotating blades that can chew through a car engine block, now being fed tangled mountains of nylon nets. These nets arrive straight from ports and coastal villages, still caked with salt, seaweed, and often the remains of whatever they caught. Workers haul them onto conveyor belts, pulling out stray hooks and cables by hand, then feed them into the grinding fury. The noise is deafening, the air thick with dust. But inside that chaos, the first miracle happens. The ghost net is reduced to confetti-sized nylon flakes, ready for its resurrection. But shredding is the easy part. The real battle is cleaning, because those flakes are filthy. They're coated in fish oil, salt, and invisible microorganisms. To become reusable nylon, they must be scrubbed down to the molecular level. The flakes get flushed through boiling water and industrial detergents, then passed through a series of filters that catch even microns-wide contaminants. Why so obsessive? because a single grain of sand that survives this wash will later clog a spinneret, snapping a filament and ruining an entire spool of yarn. So the cleaning line is unforgiving. For every 10 pounds of net fed in, up to 3 pounds are rejected as unrecoverable waste. That's sewage, not salvation. Already, the fantasy of a perfect circular economy is cracking. But the flakes that survive are now pristine. They move to the extruder, a heated barrel that melts them at over 250 degrees Celsius, forcing the molten nylon through a die plate like spaghetti. The strands are cooled in a water bath and chopped into tiny pellets. These pellets are identical to virgin nylon on a chemical level. They can be bagged, shipped, and spun into yarn that becomes Patagonia jackets, Costa sunglasses, and even Jenga blocks. Companies pay a premium for this material, and the marketing writes itself. Your purchase just saved a sea turtle. Yet here is where the story takes a sharp turn. That premium only works if the pellets can be produced at scale. And that's the dirty secret. The global supply chain for ghost nets is broken. Most lost gear at sea is too difficult and expensive to retrieve. The nets that do get recycled come from dockside collection programs, but the logistics are brutal. Imagine a fishing village in remote Chile or the Alaskan Aleutians. A single ton of nets costs hundreds of dollars just to bale, load, and ship. Meanwhile, the landfill fee nearby might be free. For a fisherman who's just pulled in a net full of holes after a 12-hour shift, why pay to recycle when you can dump it for nothing? The incentives are upside down. Nicole Baker, who founded Net Your Problem, stared at this equation for years. She knew the only way to make it work was to flip the calculus. So she borrowed a concept from trash collection. If you can't charge for recycling, you charge for the avoidance of pollution. She convinced brands and local governments that paying to remove ghost gear from the waste stream was cheaper than dealing with its long-term environmental destruction. In effect, she was selling a future that hadn't arrived yet. And for a while, it worked. Grant money flowed, pilot projects launched, and the machinery hummed. But every machine runs on razor-thin margins. The recycling lines need steady volume to avoid idle time, and grant money is seasonal. One delayed shipment, one plummet in oil prices that drags virgin nylon down, and the whole operation is underwater again. The entire industry was walking a tightrope, and the winds were starting to pick up. That's when a radical new technology emerged. One that promised to cut the ropes entirely and turn even the most contaminated nets into pure gold. But it would also demand a price no one was ready to pay. That story begins now. The technology was chemical depolymerization. Unlike mechanical recycling, which simply melts and reshapes nylon and can only handle flakes that are already near perfect, this process breaks the polymer all the way back down to its original monomer, caprolactam. Imagine unbaking a cake to recover eggs and flour. That's what depolymerization does to nylon. The result? A raw material chemically indistinguishable from petroleum-derived virgin material. It eliminates the contamination problem entirely because every single molecule of nylon is stripped from the salt, the fish oil, even the different types of nylon blends that mechanical recycling can't tolerate. And one company had spent 15 years perfecting this process in a massive factory in Slovenia with a sister plant in Italy. Aquafil, the creators of Econil, had built a machine that could swallow fishing nets by the ton, mixed with fabric scraps and used carpets, heat them in the presence of specific catalysts, and distill back pure caprolactam. That monomer is then repolymerized into nylon 6 yarn, which Patagonia, Gucci, Adidas, and dozens of household brands buy at a premium. For the first time, the promise of a truly circular nylon economy felt real. But here is the catch, and it's a big one. The depolymerization process consumes enormous amounts of energy, far more than mechanical recycling. The temperature needed to crack the bonds and distill the monomer runs continuously for hours. When you trace the carbon footprint, a pair of Econil tights might actually carry a higher production footprint than conventional nylon if the grid powering the plant isn't clean. And the chemical baths required aren't benign. While the catalysts are recovered and reused, the process generates toxic byproducts that must be carefully neutralized. This wasn't a clean miracle, it was an industrial trade-off dressed in green. The pressure mounted when a leaked life cycle analysis revealed that, under certain energy mixes, chemically recycled nylon had a global warming potential comparable to virgin production. Environmental groups that had championed ocean cleanup began to fracture. Some called it a shell game. You pull nets from the sea, market the salvation story, but the factory behind it runs on fossil electricity and emits carcinogens. The brands that had built their sustainability credentials on recycled nets suddenly faced accusations of greenwashing. The entire industry was caught between the narrative they'd sold and the physics they couldn't escape. Then it got worse. Aquafil's raw material supply was itself a bottleneck. The fishing nets collected through programs like Net Your Problem and Bureo were never enough. The plant needed consistent feedstock, so it supplemented with factory waste and post-consumer carpets, materials that were already easily recyclable. The haunting question resurfaced. If the nets were just a drop in the ocean of input, what exactly was being cleaned up? The ghost gear became a marketing asset, a convenient emblem of ocean heroism, while the real heavy lifting happened out of sight. The fishermen watched the spectacle from the docks, still lugging their torn nets to the landfill because the recycling pickup hadn't been funded this quarter. Nicole Baker saw the hypocrisy clearly. She started saying in industry panels, if we can't make the economics work for the fishermen, we don't have a circular economy. We have a charity. Her company had diverted over £1 million of gear, but she admitted that without policy mandates and brand fines, the system would collapse the moment the grants dried up. Yet, even as the infighting raged, a quiet truth was emerging. The net recycler, for all its flaws, had already changed something irreversible. It proved that a ghost could be killed and resurrected as something beautiful. The question was no longer whether it could be done, but whether we would choose to do it honestly. And that would come down to a single decision made in a boardroom 5,000 miles away, where the fate of the ocean's deadliest killers would be decided not by environmentalists or fishermen, but by accountants looking at a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet landed on a Tuesday. It was tucked inside a quarterly financial review at a global apparel giant. A single line item buried under sustainability premiums. The number showed that switching from virgin nylon to recycled ocean-bound pellets would raise raw material costs by 18%. The finance team slid the report across the table, and for 23 seconds, the room was silent. Then the CEO asked a question no one had dared voice out loud. Will the customer even notice? That question had haunted the net recycler from day one. For years, brands had treated recycled nylon as a marketing line, a story to tell on hang tags. But when the accountants ran the math, stories didn't offset margins. The only way the premium made sense was if consumers paid for it, and the data was ambiguous. Surveys said people cared about ocean plastic. But when given a choice between two identical jackets, one with a higher price tag and a tiny logo reading Net Plus, most shoppers grabbed the cheaper one. The ocean remained invisible at the checkout counter. The boardroom decision came down to a brutal but brilliant solution. Make it invisible. Instead of charging more for the recycled jacket, the company absorbed the 18% across its entire line, raising every product by a fraction of a percent. The cost was spread so thin, no customer could detect it. In exchange, all nylon across the brand would transition to recycled content within 5 years. Overnight, the demand signal for ghost net pellets tripled. The fishermen felt it first. In Chile, where Bureo had struggled to convince aging artisanal fishers that their trashed nets had value, suddenly collection trucks were showing up weekly. The price per kilo of discarded nylon climbed from zero to a modest but reliable number. Nets that once festered on beaches or were burned in open pits began stacking up at coastal warehouses, baled and ready for export. A fisherman named Alejandro, 62 years old, told a local reporter he'd made enough from discards to repair his boat engine, something he'd put off for 4 years. At the shredder plant in Slovenia, the feed lines ran 24 hours a day. The cleaned flakes poured into the depolymerization tanks, where the long nylon chains cracked apart and reformed into caprolactam monomers, so pure they were indistinguishable from petroleum-derived material. The resulting econol yarn spun out of the spinner's flawless white filament, wound onto spools destined for a Patagonia factory in Vietnam. A jacket born from a killer net was now indistinguishable from one made of virgin nylon. The ghost had vanished, only the documentation remained. But here is the twist nobody expected. The surge in demand created a problem no one had planned for: not enough ghost nets. The coastal collection programs had cleared the easy sources. What remained was actually in the ocean, hundreds of thousands of tons draped over coral reefs, tangled in shipwrecks, drifting in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. To scale further, the industry would have to go and retrieve them at vastly greater cost, with dive teams and underwater robots. And that's exactly what happened. A network of volunteer divers, Ghost Diving Foundation, had been doing this for years anyway, pulling monofilament nets off wrecks in the North Sea and Mediterranean. Now, for the first time, they had a funded path to sell what they retrieved. The nets they brought up were the worst of the worst. Encrusted with dead coral, heavy with lead weights, so degraded, they crumbled in handling. But they were nylon, and the recycler took them, lead weights and all, tossing the sorted mass into the shredder's mouth. The last boundary between garbage and gold had dissolved. This is the real story of the net recycler. It's not a fairy tale of pure technology solving a pollution problem. It's a story of accountants making a spreadsheet work, of fishermen being paid for their waste, of divers risking their lives for filament worth a few euros a kilo, and of a consumer who still might not know any of this. The ocean ghosts are being hunted now, systematically, and turned into objects you might be wearing right now. The machinery is far from perfect. The carbon math's still messy, the marketing still louder than the science. But the nets are coming out of the water, and they're not going back. The real miracle of the net recycler isn't the shredder or the depolymerization tanks. It's the alignment of forces that were never supposed to converge. A fisherman in Chile, a diver in the North Sea, a Slovenian engineer, an accountant in a boardroom, and you wearing a jacket spun from an ocean ghost. None of them set out to solve the problem alone. But when the incentives flipped, the entire system tilted, and what was once waste became too valuable to leave in the water. This story exposes something bigger. We often frame pollution as a technology problem, but ghost nets weren't defeated by a single invention. They were defeated by a business model that made their retrieval inevitable. The question is, what else in our lives is being treated as garbage simply because no one has yet figured out how to pay for its resurrection? The next time you see a price tag or hear a sustainability promise, ask yourself who is really footing the bill. The machinery is rarely the hardest part. The hardest part is deciding that it matters enough to make the spreadsheet work. If you want more stories about the unseen infrastructure transforming our world, subscribe and hit the bell. Drop a comment below. Would you pay an extra 18% for a jacket that once killed a whale? Let's talk about it. See you in the next one.